Welcome to Animation Samurai's Flash Basic Training, Lesson 2. In the last lesson, we covered a couple of the main panels, the stage, the timeline, and the properties window, which are three of the most commonly used menus in the program. And now we're going to get into a little bit about what some of the tools do over here on the left. The first tool is our selection tool. And if you hover over each one of these tools, that's kind of neat. It'll tell you the name of the tool, and then in parentheses it gives you the hotkey. So the selection tool hotkey is V. So if we create a shape, we'll create a circle shape on our stage. We'll see that if we use our selection tool, we can click the circle, and you'll notice there's a line around the circle. That's called the stroke. We can select the stroke. So our selection tool allows us to select separate elements based on what's on the stage. So we have a gray fill and we have a black stroke. And if we double click the fill, it will select both the fill and the stroke. Now, something interesting about Flash that I found, and I found this rather, I wasn't used to this because I wasn't used to working in vector programs before Flash. We'll notice that if we select the fill, we're able to drag the fill outside of the stroke, and vice versa. If we select the stroke, we're able to drag the stroke outside of the fill. So we have these two separate elements. They're both on the same layer. If we look up at our timeline, we see that where there once was a blank keyframe, there's a black dot there to show us that there's something on our layer, which is our circles. So now if we select our circle, if we select our fill, and we drag that on top of our stroke, and we let go and we click off the stage, we'll notice something very interesting happens when we try to select our fill and we drag it off of the stroke. The stroke is now gone. That information is lost, and the fill absorbed it. And that's something that's unique to working in vector programs when two elements are on the same layer. You don't ever want to make a mistake and have a fill, cover over stroke and think that you're going to be able to click off that, click on, and then that stroke's going to be there. It's going to be gone. That can be actually very useful at times too. So it's just important to understand a little bit of the dynamics of how that works. We can select everything with our tool. If we use our selection tool and we drag, we get a bounding box that selects everything that we drag. We can hit delete, and once again I'll create a new circle. And what I'm doing when I'm creating that circle, well, we'll get into that in just a second. So our circle is created. If we double click on the circle and we look in our properties menu, we have all sorts of information here. I'm going to go through here and just talk a little bit about what we're seeing. First of all, Flash is telling us that it is a shape, and underneath the shape we have a position and size drop down, and that tells us X and Y coordinates, and it tells us width and height values. And these values are adjustable from the properties menu. So if we click and drag left or right on the X, you'll notice that our circle moves along the x-axis, and then if we click and drag on the y, it's going to move along the y-axis. So that's one way we can manipulate shapes on the stage. And then the same with the width and the height. If we select the width and we drag it, we'll notice that the width of the circle changes as well as the height. Now you're asking, well, how come you're dragging the width and it's adjusting the height as well? It's because this little symbol right here, it looks like a chain. If we hover over it, it says that the values are locked together, and that means that when we scale one, it scales the other. If we click that and break it and then scale the width, we'll notice that only the width is adjusted, or if it's the height, it's just the height that's manipulated. So that's actually extremely useful at times. You can undo that, and I generally keep this locked. Underneath the width and the height, we have fill and stroke. The little pencil symbol represents the stroke. The paint bucket represents the fill, and the squares represent the color of the respective stroke or fill. So we have a black stroke, we have a gray fill. And if we click on the thumbnail of the color, we get a palette that allows us to change the color. So we can change this, if we want, we can make the stroke blue, and we can make the fill yellow, and we get something like that. That's very painful to the eyes. We'll undo that. And then underneath the fill and the stroke, we have a stroke option with a slider, and it's currently set to 0.10. That represents the thickness of the line. That's the stroke. So if we select off the circle, we'll notice that the stroke is barely visible. It's extremely thin. But if we select the stroke and we drag this, you'll notice that the stroke gets a lot thicker, and you can go up to 200. So that's kind of a nice option to have. And then underneath that we have a style, and the style drop down represents the style of the stroke. And we have a couple options here: solid, dashed, dotted, ragged, stippled, hatched. And if we make our stroke larger, you can see what those options do. You can play with that on your own time. Most of the time I just keep it set to solid. And then underneath that we have scale, which is a drop down, and I would recommend not messing with that. It's more for advanced features that we're not going to get into for right now. And then underneath that there's a couple options named cap and join, and these have to do with how strokes, how lines interact with one another. And that's something else for a different day. So that's our selection tool. We have another option that we can use to select, which is the lasso tool. And if we select that, if you're familiar with Photoshop, the lasso tool is it's a free-form way of selecting. So for instance, if we go back very quickly to the main selection tool by hitting V, we get the arrow here. You'll notice that we can click different things that we want to select, or we can drag on the stage and select a rectangle shaped selection like that. And once it's selected, we're free to drag it apart or manipulate it however we want. But what if we wanted to get more of an organic selection of the circle with curves? We would want to use the lasso tool. So we hit L, and that pulls up the lasso tool, and you'll notice we're free now to click, and we can get these nice curved shapes like so. And then if we go back to our selection tool with the V, we can drag that out, and we have a very abstract shape that we've selected. So that's kind of nice to be able to do as well. And last but not least for today, I'm going to change the colors here. I want to talk about the transform tool, and that's this third option right here. If we hover over, it says free transform tool. The hotkey for that is Q. And so if we have our circle selected and we select the transform tool, we now get a bounding box around our circle with different points. If we select a corner point, we'll get a little arrow that's going from the upper left to the bottom right, and if we select that, we're able to scale the circle up and down and adjust its width and height freely. If we hold the shift key down, that's going to lock it into a perfect circle shape, right? If we let go of shift and start moving around, it's going to be unlocked, and we can get squash and stretch shapes like so. If we select the middle point, that allows us to adjust just the height. If we select one on the side, that's just the width. And if we hover over a corner point, we get a half circle shape with an arrow, and that's our rotation tool, right? So you'll see if we have an oblong, if we have an ellipse like so, we can rotate it and we can spin that around, which is extremely useful. And then last but not least, if you hover over one of the lines around the bounding box, we get the skew tool, and we're able to skew the shape. And you can get a very wide variety of shapes using the skew tool. And this is a tool that I actually use quite often with Flash animation when I'm either feeling lazy or I have a tight deadline and I'm not able to draw as many drawings as I would like. You can use the skew tool to fool the eye in a lot of situations and make it look as if a drawing is changing when really you're just skewing it. So that's going to be it for this lesson. We covered the selection tool, the lasso tool, and the free transform tool, and we talked about the properties menu and how lines and fills interact with each other in vector programs.